Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Usher, and this is the World of Higher Education podcast. Welcome back to our third season of this podcast on global higher education affairs. If, like many of our fans, you consume this podcast as text, you probably won't notice much change. But if you're actually watching me right now, you'll know that we've made the jump from audio to video. An absolutely naked attempt to tap into YouTube and its larger audiences. We hope you like the new format. Today, our guest is Simon Marginson. He's Emeritus Professor of Higher Education at Oxford University, until recently the Director of the Center for Global Higher Education in the United Kingdom, Editor-in-Chief of the journal Higher Education, and a very regular commentator on higher education matters around the world for outlets such as University World News. If there's anyone in the world who can hold a mirror to the entire span of global higher education affairs, it's Simon. And that's why we invited him on to our first podcast of this season. Simon and I spent a lot of time in this interview talking about which countries are up and which countries are down in the world of higher education. To a large extent, that's a matter of demographics and geopolitics. And really, the global bright spot here is still China, which year after year after year manages to improve its higher education sector and its outputs. We also discussed issues of academic freedom and institutional autonomy, and the extent to which these issues are resonating on pretty similar frequencies, both in the West and in what we might call the East in China. Maybe the most interesting part of the discussion had to do with notions around the purpose of higher education. Simon and I sparred a bit about the role of employability and what responsibility institutions have to achieve it for their graduates. But maybe the bit I found most interesting was Simon's views on the roles of big American universities and their role as a global role model for a certain type of academic freedom and institutional autonomy. He thinks that, in fact, we might have been grossly underestimating their value as a model. And that's making him nervous about the potential ramifications of a Trump election come November. But enough from me. Let's listen to Simon. So, Simon, let's get down to business. It's mid 2024. What's the state of global higher education right now? What parts of the global system are doing well and which ones aren't doing so well?
Good question, as Shrek would say. Problems at the border in many countries. Universities are facing more muscular governments in relation to people mobility. But I'd say on the whole, the pattern is varied across the world. Otherwise, East and Southeast Asia traveling pretty well in terms of finance and the sort of general state of the play with the public reception of higher education. Europe worried about the far right, but otherwise, I think higher education's traveling okay. Probably some uplift overall in the Arab world and India. I'm not sure about Iran. I don't know enough about it. It's a big system. Problems in the United States, serious problems with the political reception of higher education on the Republican side of politics, and the possibilities of a Trump government are really alarming, given what's being said in relation to what Trump might do and the Supreme Court's involvement in the sector.
So you've written a lot about the growing effects of geopolitics on higher education. And there's been a gradual undoing of cooperation between East and West. And by East, I guess I mean China and increasingly Russia, and West, I mean the OECD. Do you think this estrangement is likely to get worse before it gets better?
I would say yes till it gets worse. But I would separate the Russia and China problems. I mean, I think they've got different dynamics, and Russia's, a simple case of, the Putin's basically broken the multilateral consensus worldwide, and brought warfare back to Europe, which has created tremendous problems and anxieties, not least, of course, separated Russian universities from the world university networks, and made it impossible for us to deal directly with the institutions, because their rectors have all signed up to the war. Whereas the China problem is different. I think China's pretty keen to stay engaged with the West, but the US, in its wisdom, decided to decouple from China and to see China as a threat and a problem in higher education, along with, the economy and everything else. So I was just in China, like in June. I spent most of June there, and the abiding feeling there is that the people hope that things will go back to where they were, that there will be a restoration of good relations with the US, and the US engagement was so important in China's universities, so
Mm.
transformative in so many ways, in a positive sense. And I had to tell people I thought it wasn't going to reverse, and the US saw science and technology in universities as part of the general geopolitical problem, um, of primacy at the world level, and China's strength in universities is no longer welcomed by the US, and don't expect any more help from there. Was my message, and I think that people, the realists in China, realize that that's the game they're in now. It's just like the realists in the US realize that they're in a long game, long conflictual game as well. I don't see any solution to this problem short of things getting so bad on the environmental front that we all start to work together again.
How long do you think it would take to reverse these tendencies? So, I mean, let's say the war ends in Russia,
Mhm.
or China is seen as less of a threat. How quickly do you think these old networks of cooperation could be revived?
Well, I think right now you could revive both quite quickly because there's a lot of people who establish cooperative relationships on both sides. The West End Russia and the West End China, still in the game and still, would welcome a return to cooperation. I think the sector has generally been collaborative sector at world level, and hasn't reflected a sort of conflictual geopolitics historically. Perhaps since the 80s, since globalization really took off, there's been a sort of very open approach to cooperation across the world in the sector, and been one of the reasons why we all like working in universities and on international stuff is that it's so much win-win and so on. But I mean, in the end, we are creatures of our nations. I think if the governments pull hard enough, they pull the universities back to the nation. And in most respects, I mean, some forms of collaboration are perhaps survive under any circumstances, but especially intellectual sort of cooperation and exchange. But the sort of the big items, the big cooperative programs in science, the big people mobility cooperations, the exchange of undergraduate students, for example, between the US and China, quite important at one point and withering now. I mean, those things do depend on states. So they do depend on cooperation, you know, between states. And so it's hard to get back to, things unless there's a change at the geopolitical level. But, I do think the sector itself could cooperate quite quickly if there was a political shift.
Yeah. Well, one thing that strikes me that's really changed in the last decade or so has been the way that different nations conceive of the mission of universities. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, you and I met in Shanghai at one of the meetings of
Right.
the academic rankings of world universities, and those were born of a particular moment where it
Yeah.
seemed like the entire world kind of believed that research production of new knowledge
Mm.
was really the purpose of universities. I think we've seen over the last decade or so, and you see it in the kinds of rankings that are popping up. That in the West you see a lot more interest in contributions to communities, the social mission, sustainability, inclusion, those kinds of things. Whereas in China and some other parts of Asia, universities' missions seem still really tied to research production. And you see this, I mean, in the most recent Leiden rankings, I think 7 of the top institutions for research production are now in China.
Yeah.
Um, I
Yeah.
mean, do you think that changes the way that people think about cooperation?
Yeah, two things there. I mean, I agree with you, and I think one thing is that to mention is that the science budget is booming in Singapore and China, and to a lesser extent, Korea and Japan is now back as a science producer. It's respending again. Taiwan's still underspending, perhaps, but and Japan's not spending as much as the others. But um, generally, it's a boom time for government-funded science in East Asia, and particularly, of course, the large universities in China have extraordinary public support. They've had over a period of 3 decades, it's just built and built and built, goes up 10% a year, and this has not stopped despite the slowdown of the Chinese economy. So yeah, I think you will see a continuation of this whole trajectory of building science, global science in East Asia. The other thing is that I think that ideologically or policy-wise might be a nicer way to put it. The East Asian countries perhaps have bought into the knowledge economy idea more than almost anywhere else. The idea that if you build science and technology capability, that'll flow through modernization and economic performance and also defense and military capacity as well, I think, is playing a part in that thinking. All those things will flourish if you're spending money on science and technology. And perhaps there's an exaggeration of the potential of the knowledge economy idea there that in East Asia. Certainly, there's been something of a shift away from economic objectives in many Western countries with a focus on security and national military preparation and competitiveness and the political, I suppose populism is driving this sort of, emphasis on the political rather than the economic, particularly on national identity and nativism. And I don't think East Asia's given up the economy just yet. I mean, it's where East Asia, in a sense, is still in the previous period where, the knowledge economy idea was really sustaining higher education policy worldwide.
Or come back to populism in a second here, but I want to talk about institutional autonomy, because even though we do have these, a little bit of a divide between, say, China and the West, it seems like institutional autonomy is on the decline in both halves of the world, right?
So I agree with you. It's got different trajectories, but yes, absolutely. And I think we're seeing a reassertion of the nation state in all kinds of ways, and one of the ways is that the nation state has problematized science, technology, and higher education in a way that it wasn't problematizing them a few years ago. And most countries seem to be moving towards greater regulation and control rather than less. Of course, the states have never been very far away in East Asia, but you are seeing a more obvious shift probably in the West with some. I was really surprised by the way that when Trump moved towards on the China initiative in 2018, how the American presidents all fell into line, and so which made me think about the question of autonomy, because until that happened, I did hear various American university leaders saying that they saw this as a university matter rather than a state matter, and they were going to continue to pursue good links and relationships. But when push came to shove, when it became a big national security issue, everyone fell into line. But the more worrying thing, of course, is what's happening on the with the Republican intervention at state level and the potential for that to happen through the court and through federal legislation after the election, if Trump is in power.
Yeah. So, I mean, on that, let's focus just on the West now. Like, where, in many, maybe even most countries, we've seen populist attacks on the higher education sector. Are there some countries you think that are where the sector is dealing better with those attacks than others?
Playing out differently, isn't it, in different places? And Orban in Hungary, of course, is a prime example of a government which has seen hobbling the universities as a social and political and cultural force as part of securing political control through the state, and that's the example which the Republicans sometimes cite in the US is the way to go. But where the National Rally in France and the far right in Holland and Germany haven't been talking about higher education to the same extent, and although they may well do so if they especially if they're in power. And I mean, an interesting example is Meloni in Italy. I think this is a very clever far right government, which has really got under everyone's radar now, and is putting its own people into every major institution and securing long-term control over the society, and has already announced a cultural agenda and a more nativist approach, and possibly will revive the idea of leaving the EU as well. When the time comes when that's going to work for them. Now, they have not tackled the universities directly at all. The Italian sector is quite interesting because it's probably not very well organized at national level, but there's quite a lot of a substantial role for higher education for universities in a lot of cities in Italy. They're important places. So you think of Meloni's agenda eventually will bring itself into collision with academic autonomy in Italy, but it hasn't really happened yet.
Are there any places where you think where higher education systems are able to resist a little bit? Like, Where are they doing best at pushing back at that increasing state control?
I don't think that we've seen an example of the successful political actors in the sector who've been able to secure public support to protect themselves. And my sense is that the sectors are sort of a bit like a house of cards politically and can be pushed over fairly easily. Perhaps we shouldn't say such things in public, but we might be inviting trouble. But um, well, despite the fact that our people are so well entrenched in the elites in all countries, and play major roles in industry sectors and in all the leading professions, and have a following in the arts communities, and all the places where you'd think you know the public culture or the civic culture can be extended. Despite all of that, we don't seem to be very good at mobilizing support.
Simon, we've mostly been talking about the West and China, but that leaves out an awful lot of the world's
Mm.
higher education systems, right? Obviously, there's the world's second largest system is in India. There's the rest of
Mhm.
South Asia and Central Asia, the Middle East, Africa, Latin America. What do you think? And these are all countries where research is less central to the role of universities, right? These are countries where massification is still happening, and that's still job one to fill more people into these systems. What do you think are the most important challenges these institutions are facing over the next, say, 2 to 5 years?
Alex, I'd say yes and no to that. I think obviously building mass higher education is still the driving project in, say, most of Latin America, for example. But then when you look at the research data, you look at the science data, in global science data in England, of science that's published in English, that goes into the bibliometric collections, goes into Web of Science and Scopus. What you see there, I think, in the last 20 years is the explosive growth of science in a whole range of non-Western countries. Now, obviously China, but also in East Asia, South Korea, and uh, India. As you say, it's a very big
Mhm.
system now. It's third biggest science producer, as well as being the second or largest number of students, or it's going to be the largest number of students pretty soon. Um, but it's the third biggest science producer, and it's well ahead of all the European countries now, like Germany and the UK is well ahead of Japan. And you've got Brazil, which is a big player.
Mhm.
Iran's a big player.
Mhm.
Indonesia, who would have thought, if you go back 20 years, practically no science papers at all. Now almost 40,000. So there's something happening there as well. And in Thailand, Malaysia, also you're seeing an uplift in science. So we have seen the spread of the research university and scientific research to a much larger number of countries. So, and this, I think, fits in with the general argument that we're seeing the emergence of multipolarity, even though it may not be that we're going to get more than two very big players on the world stage, or three if you include the EU as a player. But certainly at the next level, the kind of what you might call the middle countries, a really large number of them now, not only the European big players like Germany and France, but also, the Irans and Indonesias and South Koreas and South Africa and Brazil and so on, really having quite a lot of autonomy on the world stage, having the capacity to pick and choose which side of a side of the Cold War they'll align themselves with, and so on, and freely exercising that kind of political clout, which it makes, I think, the whole period rather different to what we've seen up to now.
Do you see any of those countries being particularly close to the Chinese model in the way that, I mean, China was able to both expand massively and increase its science production at the same time at some rather phenomenal rates. So any of those strike you as being particularly China-like?
No, not directly, but I mean, I don't think the Chinese model is easy to replicate, to be honest. But although you do have a general phenomenon in the East Asia of this tremendous commitment to knowledge and education, and the Confucian family syndrome, driving that in many ways, and that's common to the whole region. But yeah, no, I don't think you're going to see many more miracles like the Chinese miracle. But partly, of course, has been funded by this extraordinary growth of the Chinese manufacturing sector, and that too is not going to be easily replicated elsewhere. But I'd say Indonesia and India are both on a very rapid growth path, and they're both going to end up pretty big in terms of universities and science.
I want to turn to another topic that you've written about quite a bit in the last little while, and that's about employability and the role that employability is playing in uh, um, policy making. Um, the governments are instructing institutions to be much more um, instrumental about the way that they train people for jobs. And you've pointed this out. This is not a good outcome. That the universities aren't meant to have that kind of instrumentality. But I wonder, isn't this kind of a natural outgrowth of massification? I mean, the way that universities grew and got more funding was that in most countries, was that they argued, well, we need more university graduates in order to fund the economy. It's all about employment. It's about growth. Isn't this kind of turnabout as fair play? Like this is university's own arguments coming back to life.
Mhm. I think there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, I suppose I resist the idea that if it's based on arguments, then it's a natural occurrence.
Well,
But I agree with you that it's followed from the arguments. And I mean, I think what happened was the human capital idea. This sort of idea that if you educate people on their productivity, it increases and they become more productive workers, and they create greater value in the economy, and they also create more value for themselves as workers through their salaries. That sort of simple linear narrative of the relationship between education and work, education improves, expands, that drives economic development and growth. That simple narrative was a godsend to the universities and perhaps even to the school sector as well. And,
mm,
everyone seized on it and ran with it for 5 decades, 6 decades. So yes, it's been really entrenched as a dominant narrative, and it's the sector that's as much responsible for that as anyone else is. But I think the problem that we have with this is not, simply that policy, but the problem is that what we do in terms of knowledge intensive teaching and learning, forming people culturally through a cultural process of immersion in knowledge, and then hoping that, that when they go out to the workplace that they're going to be productive and effective. Um, um, you know, the problem is what we do is not very economic. I mean, if you're going to design the system around productivity and, and maximize maximum economic value, I don't think you would have, you know, caps and gowns or academic disciplines or professors or universities in their present form. I mean, it the actual forms of higher education, especially the knowledge intensity, way of teaching, and the economic model don't fit together very well. So we've got the situation where we don't look very efficient or effective in terms of that model, which we have done so much, as you rightly said, to entrench in the public mind. And I don't know how we're going to work our way out of that problem, but um, it's perhaps possible that we will find ways to put a broader understanding of higher education on the agenda. But at the moment, anyway, I think the understanding is becoming more narrow rather than broader. So we're in some trouble with this.
yeah. And I hear that at a rhetorical level from governments. Governments, it's a nice stick that they can beat universities with. It's about employability, it's about jobs, young people, et cetera, et cetera. Interestingly, it's not happening in China, right? Where China now, you've got graduate unemployment up around 20%, and yet I don't see the government getting upset with universities about that. But are there some places that we really need to watch out for, where governments are taking really strong policy steps to force universities into line? I know Australia, there was the Job Ready Graduates program, which sort of, tried to use price signals to browbeat students into particular fields of study. But where else are we seeing those kinds of things?
Right. I mean, I think in China it does take a form. The kind of reductionist employability argument is playing out there. But what happens there is that there's been, I mean, as its role of universities, higher education, is very well entrenched historically in China as a sort of way of sorting the population. And the top echelon is seen as the 985 universities, the double world class ones. They're seen as appropriate places for a broader formation, and that's where there's small number of liberal arts experiments and so on have played out. But in the middle and lower levels, it's seen as a vocational sector primarily. And and higher education is in no real danger in China because it's such a valuable sorting mechanism for the state. The state uses higher education quite brutally to pass the responsibility for social outcomes back to the individual. I mean, that's a more complete process, I think, in China than it is in the West. So in a way, China's sort of very vocational and very instrumental about it, despite the veneer of sort of, intellectualism in the top layer. But whereas in the West, I think it's had to be the more narrow employability agendas had to be imposed specifically or created specifically. And there was that a case in Australia prior to the election that brought in the present Labor government, where they were talking about job-ready graduates, and micro-credentials in place of higher education degrees rather than as a supplement. Of course, the sector manoeuvred brilliantly, as it usually does when faced with less than totally powerful reform ideas. It absorbs the ideas that are less than totally powerful, and it absorbed the micro-credentials idea successfully and made that marginal to its normal operation, but pursued it. In the UK, the job, I think a rather tougher proposal there coming from the Conservative government, which has just lost power. The emphasis on academic salary, the emphasis on graduate salaries as a measuring stick to check the economic performance of individual institutions and disciplines. And that has been run relentlessly through the public debate. And that has become quite powerful in terms of, I think, in shaping public expectations about universities.
So I'm curious about the balance you have between pessimism and optimism. So I mean, you've made a good point about growth and expansion, very hopeful stuff in large parts of the world, but we've also got some storm clouds on the horizon. What do you think things will look like 10 years from now? I mean, what's if I had to say, what makes you most optimistic about for higher education globally for the year 2034? What would it be?
I'm more of an optimist than a pessimist, and tend to hope for the best in human nature and hope for the best from our societies. I think that I'm increasingly worried, though, about climate and about the climate nature emergency, as many are calling it, and our inability to get to grips with that, and what you might call a failure of our collective conscience and our collective organisation in relation to these really big challenges, which we tend to put off or ignore rather than deal with. So I'm a bit worried about that one, and I think I'm worried about the universities more than I have been at any stage in my career. I think that we perhaps underestimate the importance of the American sector, as I said, in sustaining the idea of academic freedom, and that sort of Humboldtian notion of freedom to teach and freedom to research, freedom to learn. I mean, that has been sustained very much by the bottom-up faculty cultures in the US, which have been so resilient, and that in a lot of ways has shaped the global science system. And so it's become a kind of collaborative, bottom-up, academically free zone, which has not been subject to direct monkeying by governments all that much. And I suspect that now that research collaboration is in the gun sights of some of those who are concerned about geopolitics, now that faculty and student mobility is seen as a potential threat to national security, we're in a different era where academic values have been weakened in the eyes of the state and the eyes of the public. And I think that's quite serious medium term for us. It may not show itself immediately across the world, but it's certainly showing itself in particular instances now. And the general trends are all retrograde in that area. So I think there's probably reasons to be pretty worried about universities and those big global and international university bodies that meet from time to time, like the International Association of Universities. I think have really got a lot of work to do to try and to get to grips with these broader trends.
Simon, thanks so much for joining us today.
Great pleasure.
And it just remains for me to thank our producers, Tiffany McLennan and Sam Pufek, and you, the listener, for tuning in. If you have any comments or questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us at podcast@higheredstrategy.com. Join us next week when our guest will be Nick Hillman of the Higher Education Policy Institute in London. He'll be joining us to talk about the higher education strategy of the new Labour government in the United Kingdom. Bye for now.